It's a Heidelminicast. And now, Scott Clark.
We've got a letter from, an ex, a Twix, from Jacob Morosco about infant communion in the Roman Catholic Church.
If the Heidelcast helps you, won't you help us keep it going? Please make the coffer clink by clicking on the PayPal link or by sending a check to Heidelberg Reformation Association, 1637 East Valley Parkway, number 391, Escondido, California, 92027.
Well, let's read some emails, shall we?
And we shall, and this one is from Jacob, as I say, Jacob Morosco. Jacob _W Morosco. I'm sorry, Jacob. I'm sorry for butchering your last name.
Are you on dope? Are you?
No, I'm not. But I just don't know quite how to pronounce his last name, so I'm sorry about that. Forgive me. He says, Dr. Clark, do Roman Catholic infants take the Eucharist? Why or why not from their perspective? And is that practice consistent with their doctrinal system? Thanks. Well, it's a very interesting question, and it made me do some research. So I first went to, just so you know how I did it, maybe this will help you research things yourself. I went to my hard copy of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and it was published in it's in my hands here. That's the second edition, so 94, I think. 1997 is the second edition, I think. Anyway, it's numbered by paragraphs, so if I give you a page number, it might not match your edition, but beginning in paragraphs 1322 is where you would start looking for Article 3, the Sacrament of the Eucharist, and you can see the requirements for coming to the Holy Communion, or to the Eucharist, as they would say. It requires that you not be in a state of mortal sin. You have to be not conscious of having committed a mortal sin, and you have to be then in a state of grace. You have to be in good standing with the Roman Catholic Church. So in case you're wondering what might be behind the question that Jacob is asking, do Roman Catholic infants take the Eucharist? There is a controversy over Paedocommunion, infant communion. Paedo just means infant. And this has a long history. There's a post on this, an essay on this, a review, long review. It was a multi-part review, and I did it back in 2009. And you can find it at the Heidelblog, heidelblog.net. It's Children at the Lord's Table, a review. This is a review of a volume by Cornelis P. Venema, Children at the Lord's Table, Assessing the Case for Paedocommunion, Grand Rapids Reformation Heritage Books, 2009. So I reviewed it when it came out. And I'll come back to talk a little bit in a moment about what we say, what the Reformed say about Paedocommunion. But as a matter of history, there's a whole section in here in the review that sort of summarizes and interacts with what my friend Cornel Venema says about the history of Paedocommunion according to its proponents, the people advocates, because there are federal visionists advocating for Paedocommunion. Jacob is not. He's just asking a question. But they, back then, and today even, advocates of the federal vision are advocating for, calling for infant communion. And this is because they still think like Baptists. Baptists don't distinguish between the sign of initiation and the sign of renewal. But traditionally, the Reformed have distinguished between the sign of initiation and the sign of covenant renewal. So circumcision and baptism were signs of initiation, and the feasts, the whole feast structure, which was culminated in the Lord's Supper, is a sign of renewal. It's not for infants. But historically, it's been argued that it was, quote, likely the original practice of the church, close quote. Proponents argue that the loss of Paedocommunion in the Western Church was due to the doctrine of transubstantiation, that is, the doctrine that the elements of the supper become literally the body and blood of Christ in consecration. Quoting again, in contrast to the relatively strong evidence for the early and general practice of infant baptism, clear evidence for the practice of Paedocommunion in some segments of the church begins in the middle of the 3rd century. Close quote. That's from page 12 of Professor Venemus' book. Justin Martyr made reference to the, quote, proper recipients of the supper, close quote, in his first apology, chapters 12 and 13, where he taught that only those who have embraced the teaching of the church and who have resolved to live in accord with the gospel are to be communicated, that is, to receive Holy Communion. Clement of Alexandria restricted access to the table, quote, to active believers, close quote. And again, this is from Venema. Origen also, quoting again, seems to suggest that small children, same word he uses for infants relative to baptism, are restricted from communion. There's some evidence from Cyprian that during the Decian persecution in the middle of the 3rd century, the 250s, infants may have come to the table. Venema argues that this practice was probably not widespread. Contemporaneous evidence suggests that the earlier practice of restricting children from the table was the practice. Paedocommunion became a, quote, normal practice, close quote, of the church in the 4th and 5th centuries, according to Venema. This is clear from many places in Augustine's writings, and that was closely connected to his realism, that is, his doctrine, his idea that sacraments do what they do because they are what they are, and that they work ex opera, that is, by the working of them, by the use of them. The grace is necessarily automatically communicated to the recipient. And, of course, we reject that, but that is how Augustine came to think in the 4th and 5th centuries. The thing signified is or becomes the sign. It's so closely connected that the thing becomes the sign, hence the doctrine of baptismal regeneration. It's not clear when Paedocommunion became the dominant practice in the Eastern Church, but the practice, as Venemus says, quoting here, Eastern Orthodoxy since the 4th century certainly lends support to the argument that Paedocommunion enjoys the sanction of church history, close quote. He disputes the account of medieval history given by the proponents of Paedocommunion as, quote, unduly simplistic, close quote. The evidence, however, is, again quoting, prior to the 11th century, Paedocommunion was practiced, close quote, but it diminished in the period leading up to the Fourth Lateran Council, which was in 1215, AD 1215, so early 13th century, where admission to the supper was granted to those aged 7 or older. Between the 13th century and the Reformation, the practice of baptism was separated from the practice of communion. By the Reformation, again quoting here, the only groups practicing Paedocommunion were the Eastern Orthodox churches, the Armenian Church, and the Bohemian Hussites, close quote. In the Reformation, the Lutheran and Reformed admitted children only after catechetical training. Venema distinguishes between the Lutheran practice of confirmation and the Reformed practice of profession of faith, although I know of at least one Reformed denomination that uses confirmation to mean profession of faith or instruction leading to profession of faith. So it's not a hard and fast distinction. He continues by surveying Calvin's approach to the differences between baptism as the sign of new birth and incorporation into Christ, and the supper as the, quoting here, the means of nourishing the faith of believers, close quote. Wolfgang Musculus, Musculus, was one of the few dissenters, this is Venema's language, to the prevailing view. He argued for Paedocommunion on the ground that children are included in the covenant of grace with their parents, and his view was, as Venema says, quoting here, an exception to the rule among the Reformed churches of the continent and the British Isles. So there is some evidence, but the evidence of Paedocommunion in the history of the church is somewhat murky and somewhat mixed. But the Reformed churches categorically reject in their ecclesiastical documents, reject or don't allow for the practice of Paedocommunion. We need, for example, only go to Heidelberg Catechism 81, who are to come to the Lord's table. Those who are displeased with themselves for their sins, yet trust that these are forgiven them, and that their remaining infirmity is covered by the passion and death of Christ, who also desire more and more to strengthen their faith and amend their life. But the impenitent and hypocrites eat and drink judgment to themselves. That's Heidelberg Catechism 81. So it's not the case that infants are excommunicated before they are allowed to the table. That's not true. That's advocates of Paedocommunion have sometimes said that, and it's a one of those apparently clever rhetorical moves that people make. But in fact, people are not being excommunicated. They're being prepared to receive Holy Communion. Again, we have to be careful not to confuse the sign of initiation with the sign of renewal. Those are two different things. They have two different functions. And we do certainly anticipate our children making profession of faith and being admitted to Holy Communion, but they're not the same thing. But the direct answer to Jacob's question is no. Ordinarily, as far as I can tell, looking at the Catechism, Roman Catholic Catechism, and other resources, it does not appear that in Rome, infants receive the Eucharist.
This is the Heidelcast. Text the Heidelcast at any time at 760-618-1563. Heidelcast.
One more thing before we go. There is a new series coming up on the weekly edition of the Heidelcast as we are beginning to draw to a close our study in the book of Romans. We still have a few more episodes in the book of Romans, but coming up, we are working on a brand new series, and the title of it is
Feathers and All, the Scriptures Are Enough.
Just in case you didn't get that.
Feathers and all, the Scriptures are enough.
Is that scary enough for you? Feathers and all, the Scriptures are enough. So that will tell you how we're coming at this. We're going to be examining the question particularly of continuing revelation. And basically the phrase, the Scriptures are enough, is a way to paraphrase the Latin slogan that we often use, sola scriptura. So if you know friends who are interested in this question about Reformed theology and its relations to the charismatic movement and Pentecostalism, you might want to let them know about the Heidelcast. Heidelblog.net/Heidelcast. You can find the Heidelcast on any of the major podcast platforms. We're in Apple Podcasts, of course. You can find us on Spotify and anywhere good podcasts are found. So this will be coming up here shortly.
Feathers and all, the Scriptures are enough. Thanks for listening. Tune in tomorrow for more from the Heidelcast, brought to you by HeidelbergReformationAssociation.org. Don't forget, when the coin in the coffer clinks, the cost of bandwidth shrinks. Copyright Heidelberg Reformation Association. All rights reserved. This is a Heidelmedia production.